After a really very exciting and enjoyable afternoon, we are now into our keynote lecture on the first day of this wonderful symposium. And I've got the honor of introducing Anu and Dilip to you this evening. Anuradha Mathur is an architect and a landscape architect based at the School of Design at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. And her partner, Dilip da Cunha, is an architect and planner who is adjunct professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, the Columbia School of Art, and the Columbia School of Architecture, as well as the Srishti School of Art, Design and Technology in Bangalore. It's really a great honor to have you with us this evening, and I think this is your first lecture in London, isn't it?
There was, I mean, you did one at the AA, you know, one with the Mississippi
Just
exhibition a century ago.
That's fine. This is your first lecture in London.
Over 2 decades ago.
Over 2 decades ago. We're at the AA, you know. Anyway, thank you for coming, and it's wonderful to have you here. Anu and Dilip's work is focused on opportunities that water's fluidities and complexities offer for new visualizations of terrain and design imagination. This focus has guided their collaborative research and teaching practice in diverse cultural milieus such as Mumbai, Jerusalem, the Western Ghats of India, the Sundarbans, coastal Virginia, and the US-Mexico border. Mathur and da Cunha are authors of a number of books: Mississippi Floods, Designing a Shifting Landscape, Deccan Traverses, The Making of Bangalore's Terrain, and Soak, Mumbai in an Estuary. And they are co-editors of Design in the Terrain of Water. They have received many awards and grants during their career, and most recently they have been recipients of a Pew Fellowship grant for a new multimedia exhibition titled The Ocean of Rain, and da Cunha's forthcoming book, The Invention of Rivers, Alexander's Eye and the Ganga's Descent. Thank you very much for being with us.
Well, thank you so much, Lindsay, for having us, and for that introduction. It's been a real pleasure actually being here, and I must say, the day has been so full, and the kind of questions that have been raised and some of the papers that have been presented, I should say all the papers, not some of them, all the papers that have been presented so far have been so sort of provoking, I would think, and I hope that we can sort of add to the conversation, that has already begun. Now, the way we're going to do this, we normally do a duet and and that sort of thing, and we decided actually in the interest of time and conversation, I guess I'm going to begin and Anu's going to end. That's the way it'll be. So we'll take it in turns being here. Now, this question actually has been with us now for a while. Is India a river landscape or an ocean of rain? And I use India, quote unquote, because there is a whole history actually to the naming actually of a place. But the idea really here is, when we ask this question, river landscape, when we say river landscape or a land of rivers, we presume actually a language of land and water. Land is here, water's there, and that divide cannot be taken for granted. And so when we say ocean of rain, we're talking actually about a new, not new, but another language of design that does away actually with that act of separating land and water. But that is just by way of initiating the question that is going to be with us through this talk. But as Harsh pointed out, I think in that wonderful conversation, everything in India has some element of the monsoon, right? Is that what you said? Or, the way I look at it is actually that the monsoon is a starting point in India. Everything, life begins with the monsoon. So if I had to, I just want to, And that's life on the west coast of India. I mean, that's a starting point of life. And when I say that, actually, you've got to actually witness it to believe it. And I'm sure that many of you have traveled to India and in this moment of time. But when life begins, I mean, biomass increases hundreds and hundreds of times. You know, I mean, things that are brown turn green. You know, I mean, you get more. You know, you get moss actually where there was no moss. You know, in a matter of a week or 2 weeks. You know, and so it's just a remarkable shift. Now I can say that this is this was all happening in the Western Ghats, but there is some element of this actually right through the subcontinent and through the monsoon belt, entire monsoon belt. But that transformative moment all begins actually to some extent with this wind called the monsoon. I know that people read the monsoon as season, etc., etc. We see it as a wind that then brings rain, the bringing of rain. There are two models that we say: river landscape versus ocean of rain. If I had to play that out, and I'm going to spend a lot of time actually with that first model of a river landscape and how we. Oops, I'm sorry. The question we ask is, how did that profuse wetness actually become water? So how did monsoon wetness become monsoon water? And this is a drawing, of course, by Edmund Halley, of the Halley Comet fame, who did a lot of other sciences, played around with other sciences too in the 17th century. But this is what his drawing actually of the monsoon. But notice, I mean, one of the things we want to call attention to actually is the line between land and water, and that the monsoon is on the sea. And then you have a monsoon wetness that then becomes this dry land, where water finds a place. Now, how did that happen, actually? How did wetness, this profuse wetness, become this ground, where you have rivers and dry land? And then not only that, I mean, you have now so-called flows that we call rivers that become the spines, actually, of a subcontinent. In this case, of course, I mean, this is a place that we call India, and I'm extending that name, of course, to the entirety of the subcontinent that was sort of reinforced, by geology as a plate, as an individual plate. So what made this actually this divide between dry and wet? And not only that, actually, once you have identified water in flows, you then control flows. I mean, if you put this drawing of the Mississippi, because just look at how we've drawn actually all the rivers from the Ganges to the Indus, to the Kaveri. I mean, these have all been, sort of copies of the Mississippi Project flood drawing, where flows become volumes and volumes can be controlled in some way. And so this drawing over here is the linking of India's rivers, which was done actually by Arthur Cotton in 1890. And this is the project now that is being literally carried out. They're connecting India's rivers. I mean, they've already connected, rivers in the south, rivers here now, the canals that go across watersheds, but it all comes from flows that have been defined. Of course, rivers we know from history and recordings in history and the way history is written, rivers are, have contributed immensely actually to wealth creation. And today, actually, rivers are the basis of dreams in India. I was just telling folks yesterday that Bangalore has this dream of designing the Thames with their sewage. They're going to actually gather the sewage east of the city. They're going to pump it up to a hill that is close by called Nandi Hill, which is about 40 kilometers away, and it's going to come down this river, and they're going to call it, literally, actually, see it as the Thames, because they want to have the London Eye. And, I mean, I've seen the drawings actually of this. It's quite embarrassing. But these are ideas that rivers promote. And so, we're constructing rivers where there are none, I mean, because we want waterfronts. I mean, it's all about real estate ultimately, and rivers are great for it. But then it's also civilizational spines, etc., etc. But then they also bring disaster. And so when we see actually the floods in Chennai, Mumbai, places like that, and in the Himalayas where we were, you begin to see actually that flood is a drainage problem, and somehow these rivers are not operating well enough, and so you then enforce these rivers. And so the imagination, becomes one that you keep pushing, because rivers are both the solution, and the cause of the problem. And then you have, you blame it on rain. And that's what is so interesting for us, actually, that you recognize that it is rain that creates your rivers, but then, it also becomes what you blame. So, now today, I speak as a designer, and you see now designers are being called in. And I think it was Pushpa who sort of mentioned this, that levees are, traditionally actually designed by engineers, and to some extent that is true. Engineers as designers is how we see them. But designers are being called in now to assist engineers in finding solutions actually for flood and for sea level rise and things like that, because engineers figure that you need a new imagination actually to deal with some of these issues. But not only that, actually, we are also contributing to new forms of urbanization. When you look at the urban as a landscape and things like that, these are questions actually that are pushing actually the whole urbanization question. Can we define new kinds of cities? Can we define water holding systems, et cetera, et cetera? But then this development also, can we change the trajectory of development in order to accommodate the problems that we have already created? And so can developing countries leapfrog, as it were, over some of the issues that have already been created by other models of development? And then, of course, we're called in for flood infrastructure design, etc. And so we're very, to some extent involved in some of these issues. But what I want to point out actually is that this is the second act of design. There was already a first act of design that goes largely unnoticed, and that is the creation of land and water. The point is actually the act of separation is a metaphysical act of creation. That when you divide actually land and water, you're not just dividing land and water, you're creating them on either side of a line, on two sides of the line. And that act of creation actually has promoted, civilization, it's promoted colonization and the discipline of geography, which has, sort of driven this notion. Geography is grounded actually on a reading of the Earth's surface as comprised of two components, land and water. And so this notion actually of the Earth's surface that then Edmund Halley actually uses to illustrate his water movement really comes from a sort of privileged reading, that has been granted actually by an act of design. Now, where is this act of design? Has anybody read about this? It passes largely unnoticed, and it's sort of just taken for granted by most scientists. But interestingly, the only place you'll find it is in religion. If you open the Bible, you will see actually that in the book of Genesis, the acts of creation. You see the acts of creation. The first day, it's darkness, separate light from darkness. The second day, land from sea, land from water, and then you go on. And so this is the only place actually where you see it told, But if you think of what the surveyor does, a surveyor is constantly dividing land from water when they draw this line actually between, and I've spoken to surveyors and asked them, how do you draw the line between, land and sea through a mangrove? Through mangroves, we just guess. But that, to some extent, is a design, sort of purpose. And it sort of drives much of what we have constructed through the map. But it is only because we are aping a line that we see on the ground somewhere. And that act of seeing really comes from, a design that we're all cultivated into. That is why we go to school. We learn geography. So what we want to sort of interrogate for the next few minutes is, how do you actually create land and water? And we figured actually that you need a time, and you need a line. And both these things are concepts that come with a certain kind of literacy. So first, if I take time, and the way we look at time is actually in the hydrologic cycle for a moment. And of course, we all learned how to do these drawings, didn't we? In the 6th and 7th grade, we somehow, did this. Let me look at this. I mean, isn't this so magical? No? I mean, it's in a drop of water, the whole hydrological cycle. All this, it's amazing imagination if you ask kids to draw the hydrological cycle, And this is from one particular school in India, where my brother-in-law teaches, and so we asked him to collect some drawings for us. And but then, of course, scientists, tend to be more complicated, and you get, a hydrologic cycle that is, that has so many different moments in it, different moments. But we like Paul Clay's cycle, actually. That is rain. This is flow formation, etc. But his 4 moments, we'll just use that as a, as a way of actually understanding time. So if you think about it now, so there's precipitation, there's flow formation. So that's number 1. It begins with rain, and then you have flow formation on the Earth's surface, you have evaporation, and then you have cloud formation in number 4. Now, if you just look carefully here, you will see actually that we have chosen to inhabit moment 2. And in this moment, we have constructed the time of reality. In this time, maps are drawn, properties are marked, infrastructure is designed, the past is described, the present is experienced, the future is envisioned in that moment, which means that all these other moments become ephemeral. So therefore, the monsoon comes and goes. It's a visitor. And so what we have done actually is to create ephemerality by anchoring reality in one moment in the hydrologic cycle. So if I think now that everything that we have done is in support of this anchoring in this particular moment in time, in the time of water. So take this for example, that in that moment, I can separate what is above from what is below. This is the act actually on the second day, that when I say what is above and what is below, what do I mean actually? I've got to have this rain stop, because if it continues raining, I don't know where to draw this line between land and water. So I have to separate, and that will create the firmament, as it were. So I separate the clouds, so the monsoon clouds and the rain have to pass. It's the foul weather season. That's what the British called it, the foul weather season in India. So maps are fair weather landscapes, So I wait for that fair weather moment in order to do this. Then once I'm able to do that, then I'm able to separate land from water. So I get the coastline, the water's edge, the river bank, things like that, that I then draw on the map. And I have, lo and behold, a ground of design that is already designed, And so this first act now creates the ground for the second act, And so you've got to ask, actually, where did this come from? Actually, where did this idea, who drew this? Who drew this line, actually? And so you go back. So if you follow here, so this is a time and it's a nature. It's a nature that is constructed in support, actually, of a time, so with water somewhere. And it really promotes now flow thinking. So I'm able to actually contain water and actually see a flow. And I'll come back to that in a second. So the requirement of a line, it's a second demand that the act of creating land and water requires. So now there are all kinds of lines. We use lines actually in pattern forming, and we use lines in in geometry of this sort of triangulations. We use it for hashes and so on, and in letters, in alphabets. But these are not the lines that I'm talking about. I'm talking about a particular line that is gifted. It's gifted with particular abilities. So when I draw a line between land and sea, like this one, actually of the west coast of India, I'm able to get land and water, but I'm also able to, more than the act of separating. Now think of what this line is doing. It has power, so it keeps water on one side and land on the other side, but then it also calibrates flows. So I can calibrate a flow because I know an origin and I know a destination, or I know a before and an after, only by my line, actually, that water passes a line. It can be erased, it contains, and of course a line must begin. So where does this take us actually? It gives us 3 qualities, or 3 essentials, I would say, of a river. So if I had to just build on this for a second, a river has a course, a river has a source, and a river floods. Now, if you think of what this is in terms of lines, now a line flows. Again, I draw a line like that, as a river might flow. Where must a line start? A line must start in a point, and then, of course, I erase and then I redraw. Now, that's all line making. I mean, it's a literacy, actually, of the drawn line that then feeds, actually, the construction of a river. So if I ask here, as Heraclitus asks, basically a statement that he made, you cannot step into the same river twice because the water is ever flowing. Now, when he said you cannot step into, he was asking everybody to cross a line. But no one has interrogated that line that he asked them to cross. They've actually questioned, everything that, said, what did he mean by this change? Life is changing, this, nature is changing, etc., etc., etc. Was it universal? Was it particular? All kinds of philosophical questions around. But no one has actually asked this question. Who drew that line that he asked them to cross? If you look at source, if you just think of how many people have chased the source of the Nile, how many people have actually tried to find the source of the Ganges? It's incredible, actually, how much money has been spent on finding a source of what? Of a line. Why? Because that it rains all over. That a river has a source, actually, that is everywhere. Why have we been after, actually, a point? Why does everybody believe that rivers begin in a point? They made it out to be a cultural thing, but it is not. And we'll show you, actually, when it comes to the Ganges, that it is not a cultural thing. It is an act of surveying. Someone had to find, and if you look at the definition, actually, of the length of of source, it is the point, actually, of the longest length. So if I think of how the Ganges, how the Nile has been chased, from the time of Herodotus, and before, we've asked the question of, of the Nile. And then it was only actually in 2006, according to the National Geographic, an expedition was sent to find the source of the Nile. And just think of all the people from Speak, who said it was Lake Victoria, and then, after that it was Rwanda, and then it went on and on and on and on. And so they finally discovered this now, the true length, the true source of the Nile in 2006. And so, so this is sort of crazy notions. But each of these things actually have a support of ideas, actually, that have paralleled them. So if you look at the idea of paradise, when you think of paradise as actually the source, paradise is the source of 4 rivers, the Gihon, the Pishon, things like that, according to biblical sources. You begin to see, actually, that there's always been this preoccupation with the source of a river, and where do rivers begin. I can actually build a whole, there's a whole history, actually, to the search for this point, to the drawing of this line, and then, of course, flood. It's incredible, actually. Flood is nothing but water crossing a line, and a line that I can draw again. And so the whole flood cannot be natural, and so the idea of a floodplain, the ecologies that have gone in support of rivers, etc., and being called, actually, the result, I was seen as the result of flood, and therefore sort of seasonal in some respect, etc., really is a lack of accommodation of rise and falls of rain and wetness. So I'll come back to that in some point, but this notion, actually, of a natural event has been actually the source of what we consider to be criminality. In so many respects, actually, in so many parts of the world, particularly when it displaces people. And we'll come back to that. So the question we ask really is this, and I put this before you, and that is that we have lived, actually, with this nature in this particular moment of the hydrologic cycle, in which we have constructed other moments of ephemerality. And over here, what we say is, what if India, actually, and the world of the monsoons and the monsoon belt, and perhaps other places in the world, and to some extent I believe that a number of the indigenous peoples across, so-called indigenous peoples, that question is problematic, but most of them actually inhabited a moment of rain. A moment of rain. So ephemerality then actually shifts, and you get flows. So in India you find rivers that are supposedly dry, and you wonder why they're still called rivers when there's no water in them. And so we're ready to accommodate that kind of a moment. Actually, you still anchor in rivers despite there being no water in them. So why can't we anchor in rain when there's no rain? You know? So if you think about this, we want to build this and thicken this kind of an argument. But if you take this to be the first moment, and this to be the second moment, the flow formation, you begin to see actually that it leads to a more serious question, such as this, not just whether India is an ocean of rain, but has India been colonized actually over the years, over centuries actually? Has rain been colonized by rivers? Has rain been colonized so the moment of rain been colonized by the moment of rivers? And so what you have otherwise, I mean, if I had to just go back in a second here, what we have in this particular moment is rain everywhere. In other words, I work not with water, I work with wetness. And we make a huge distinction. Water comes with an imagination of land associated with it. So water is not land, land is not water. So the moment I say water to you, you will immediately discount land. So in order to actually make the point that there is water in land, I have to coin terms like wet land, things like that, in order to enforce actually that there can be, that land can be wet, but otherwise land is presumed dry. And so in a world of wetness, you will not have anything dry. You'll only have something less wet. Even a desert is wet. I mean, I do this in a desert, and I will catch, some amount of water. I mean, my very presence in a desert is water. I should say wetness, not water. So if I use water sometimes, I sometimes slip just because that's the way the language is. But I intend very often to distinguish these two as wetness, two worlds actually, one of wetness and one of water. So in a world of wetness actually, the monsoon that comes in does not necessarily hit an earth's surface. It remains suspended in the air. I mean, so I go into a cloud forest as we showed you. I go into the mist that is on the, in the field that we showed you. I mean, it does not hit a surface. It's actually a wetness that is everywhere. So it's a milieu of wetness that does not necessarily operate with the consciousness of an Earth's surface. So because I don't separate what is above from what is below, I need to separate that in order to have an Earth's surface. If I don't, basically I live with wetness. So what does it mean to live in wetness as opposed to on an Earth's surface? And so the question then that we ask here, like say, has India been colonized by rivers? And it's a very serious it leads to many other questions, and I hope to raise them actually in the next few minutes. So where did this come from actually? I mean, if you go back in time, you have to actually go back to the history, to the school of Miletus. And the school of Miletus, of course, is led by Thales, and Thales, according to Aristotle, was the first scientist or the first natural philosopher. And what he did was, and basically the school did, he and a student, Anaximander, invented the world map. And so with the invention of the world map, how do you actually draw a map? Again, you've got to make that moment, you've got to inhabit that moment, you make the separation, but you also have now a surface that I can observe. So what is the first observation you make? The Nile floods. Because you have put the water between two lines, and then you say, oh, it has crossed that line, and so the Nile floods. And so what is fascinating is that you go and ask the Egyptians then, why does the Nile flood? And they look at you like, you don't even understand your question. Why did the Nile flood? Why? Because they never saw the Nile flood. They never saw a river to begin with. So they never saw a river, they saw water actually rise and fall. So water rose and fell and then, and extended across this. How did this become the normal? And this become the abnormal? So you defined a normality in order to define an abnormality. And this sense of actually problem creation is what drives empirical science. That you define an entity, constructed an ontology, and then you've created a problem for yourself and say, aha, now I can solve something, And then, of course, you apply for grants and a lot of things like that, So if you just think now of how settlement happened in the Nile, you read someone like a Herodotus, who comes to the, it's very interesting actually reading Herodotus, because he comes to Egypt and he asks me, why does the Nile flood? And he also asks them, where's the source of the Nile? Both questions the Egyptians looked blank. He calls them stupid. You know, he doesn't think that they, you know, these guys are basically, they're ignorant. They don't know actually the basic. He never thought for a moment actually that these people are probably looking back at him and saying that, I mean, you draw the line and you say flood, I mean, what's wrong with you? You know? So, but this actually is the beginning of underdevelopment. I mean, it goes back in time. It's nothing, it's not, you know, not this colonization. I'm talking about a colonization that occurred 2,500 years ago. And so when you look at actually settlements over here, people did not live actually on a river. In Herodotus' own accounts, actually, they lived on mounds that they constructed. So when the water rose and fell, they accommodated actually by a gradient from high to low. So this was their agricultural ground. So when it rose, actually, when the Nile rose, actually, the water spread in wetness, spread, actually, and it did it under blue skies. And that is what troubled the Greeks the most. How did it happen under blue skies? Because, I mean, if you read Ovid, you know, and you think of the destruction of flood, etc., never happened in Egypt, you know. And so it was a very peculiar kind of environment in which to ask that kind of a question, which led to, you know, much of what we are seeing today. But if you think that this is the way they lived, and not like this, which is actually, you know, building an embankment. You know, that I draw the line, and on that line, then, the line becomes an embankment. We made this point in the Mississippi. The Mississippi, I mean, 200 years ago, was the line that was drawn, okay, by the European settlers. And that line has become 50 feet high now, you know, and a levee, and it's growing. There's only one way a levee goes, and that is up. You know, and so this reading of ground actually as water in a river, as opposed to wetness that rose and fell, are two different paradigms of habitation. So to the point that was made actually on the embankment, can designers actually include, make embankments that are inclusive? No, embankments are basically divisive. And actually, this binary of land and water is one of the first binaries that then lead to all other binaries of thinking. Over here, when you have gradients of wetness, you just have, like I said, there's no such thing as dry. You only have less wet, more wet, and you accommodate it actually by inhabiting it. And how that is actually is something that is now teasing us a bit. But this is the gentleman who actually took it across to the east, this idea. I mean, the student of Aristotle, Alexander, the so-called Great, did not actually conquer, you know, through battle on the battlefield. He actually conquered by drawing the ground, dividing land from water. I mean, and that sense of possession that comes before actually flow is what the river allows. If I put water and contain it, I get property, I get land, and land for possession. So he was a remarkable man actually who actually carried, was the first conqueror really who operated on the ground of a world map. He carried this map with him, the map of Hecataeus, which I showed you earlier. And I think it is, let me continue this. But what he did was, I mean, this is a man who brought an army in the rain shadow of the mountains that extended from Ethiopia, you know. And Ethiopia, by the way, is where actually the monsoon hits. And that is what caused what they saw as the flood of the Nile. It was basically rising water from rain, rising wetness from rain that actually reached the Nile and the leeward side of this hill range. Whereas over here, I mean, if you look, you come down to the Himalayas and you've got the Indus and the Ganges that actually flow onto the windward side. But he comes in the rain shadow, and then he crosses actually the Hindu Kush mountains here, and boy, he hits this, you know, which is a wetness that he could not take. You know, I mean, the wetness through which he had to then start drawing lines between, you know, and keeping water in its place. How do you do it? But he started it, you know, and so he brought in an imagination. His soldiers couldn't take it anymore, you know, in a matter of 2 years, he turned around and left, and they forced him to leave. It's fascinating. This is one guy who never lost, who never, you know, even historians today don't say he lost, you know, and, you know, they say that he somehow, there was mutiny and he had to turn around and, you know, but to some extent he was defeated by rain. He was defeated by the monsoon. But what he did was, his legacy was the line, or the act of separating land from water. I mean, it's a very lucrative thing, you must remember that, you know. And so by, you know, you see this map by Eratosthenes, you will see actually that he adds the Ganges. Now I'm talking about 2 centuries, 2nd century, 3rd century BC. This map has sort of changed from Hecate's. Hecate's map, Indus was on the east. You have now the Ganges on the east, and the spine actually are mountains from the Caucasus all the way, through the Himalayas, etc. These are reconstruction maps, but this adding of the Ganges by Alexander, even though he never reached it, he was the first person to name it. He called it the Ganges. And he spoke about Ganges as taking him to the Eastern Sea. And by the Eastern Sea, he meant this, and by which he could actually then return through the pillars of Heracles into the Mediterranean and then back home. That was his plan. But it never worked out. It never worked out that way because he turned around and then came back because he could not face the Ganges, knowing that it was a bigger river as he saw it. I won't go into the whole history of actually the naming of the river by Alexander, but this is what was possibly what we are calling actually the Ganga, and this is the Ganges. So the Ganges is a river, Ganga is rain, and so if you make that divide, you realize actually that the India that one sees is a holding of wetness, but the India that we see today, I mean, I should say India at one time, and that India in the margins is actually a field of holdings of rain and wetness, whereas this is what we all learn and study in school through geography, and then, and we're administered actually through this scheme actually of rivers and land. And so over the centuries, the Ganges has been drawn with 2 lines actually that define its flow. And this is what you ultimately have, to some extent today. This is, the so-called river. It's called now Ganga. It's the river. It's called Ganga. But we've fixed it in this path. It hates being fixed. Ganga doesn't want. She's a goddess. She doesn't like being kept between 2 lines, and so she resists and floods. But we don't change. We keep redrawing the line, and we keep redrawing the line because that is what we have been educated to do. And so we cannot change that easily. So what I say over here, it takes a cultivated eye to see rivers. It's a visual literacy, an art to call them out, and we all learn it in school. We're not born with it. We learn it. And so we're educated to appreciate the value. We learn the economics, actually, of land and real estate, et cetera, economics. All the disciplines are basically grounded in this separation. If it's one thing that actually unites all disciplines, it's the line between land and water, that they all accept. So history is written in this, with this line in mind, and so on. Did Alexander cross rivers, as all history books tell us? Or did he actually enter a ground of rain and actually walked across wetness? And from what I found out, for example, even at Varanasi, where the river now rises 40, 50 feet, at one time did not rise more than 1 or 2 feet, and people lived on that level. So there's something actually about the holding of wetness that has been destroyed, in the making of these rivers over 2,000 years, in order to create actually a dry land. But let me just go through a few things then that result actually from this drawing of the line and the choice of time, and I'll try and be quick. So once you draw the line, you can actually construct nature around it. So we have actually fluvial, we've got riparian systems, we've got this thing on the edge of rivers. We even, my definition of what is natural is that we presume that animals see it. So we assume that an animal sees a river and comes to a river. I mean, that's the way we write about it, actually. The river is so natural to us, that, and it really comes from this kind of, assertion, actually, of a flow, and so you assert a flow, and then you construct nature around it. So the notion of floodplains, et cetera, that you get civilization on it, you get histories grounded on it, you get river fronts. So the whole story, actually, of Varanasi on a river. Is that really true? If I go to this slide and see the trouble actually that British administrators, led by James Prinsep in this case, actually took on, while we enjoy actually the waterfront of Varanasi and tourists actually love it, what it actually took was this draining of a whole rain system behind, of tanks, of holding systems behind over here, been drained here, you know, in order to actually dry out this place. And the result is now that all cities have a front and a back, you know, and to some extent a middle of streets, you know. So this front is this, and this is what you get at the back. You know, you get tanks, but that back now, by draining it, we've also brought it to the front. So our rivers are nothing but sewage systems, you know, our sewage systems, because they actually afford a fantastic drainage system, you know. So sometimes we ask this question, I mean, how do, you know, we have defined actually rivers to be drains of land. And this is actually water that has been put in the service of land, which is an inequality that very few people question, you know, and in this particular binary. But by suggesting and teaching children, you know, they all learn in school, rivers drain the land, and now rivers have become drains, you know. So, but then rivers, I mean, basically once you define flows, you also then, you know, create objects of veneration. So today, I mean, the river is considered a sacred thing, you know. And if you go back actually, and we use the term descent of Ganga, now descent of Ganga is described, you know, in English translations of Sanskrit texts as actually, I mean, I won't go into the entire story, but it's basically Ganga that falls on Shiva's head, and then they describe it this way. They say it flows down the locks of his hair. And the locks means flows, and then it becomes this river, and then this river, you know, is this, basically this king leads Ganga down to a particular place, and there's a river. But the question we ask is that if Ganga is a goddess, you know, and it fell on Shiva's hair, and Shiva is a god, you couldn't count his hairs. They didn't probably gather in locks, but if they fell down as individual hairs, it was more like rain than it was like rivers, you know. And so the descent of Ganga, interestingly, you go back to the text, always translated, Ganga is always translated as Ganges river. How did Ganga become Ganges river? You know, it's not translated as just Ganges. It's always actually the word river is added to it. So there's a change of ontology over there that is constantly being made in the act of translating text. So descent of Ganga, we look at it as the descent of rain. People would look at it actually as the descent of a river, as a holy river. And this particular, you know, which is close to Chennai, you know, in Mahabalipuram, depicts apparently the descent of Ganga. But what is fascinating, and it's now a UNESCO monument, this is a UNESCO monument, and you know, everybody goes there to see this as a work of art. But actually what it is, when you look up there, on top is actually a rain-holding cistern. This is a rain-holding system that actually comes down here. It's nothing to do with a flow and a mimicking actually of the Ganges out there. It is actually telling its own story of holding of rain. You know? So this is when art actually becomes this object of conservation and preservation, and the story is told in a particular way to promote actually the notion of rivers. But now to come back, actually to come down to Meghna's landscape and what she's working on, you know, once you actually have flows, you go into places like the Sundarbans, which in this map you can see it is mush. It's mush over here. Now this is a 1500s map. You know, and then you divide land from water, and you get then a field of islands and channels. That's what you get now. And so there was this, so even before actually there was this drive to settle this world, there was that act of actually drawing the line between land and water. And you can see it here in Morrison's map. You can see the triangulation of channels in a landscape that is like this. And so what you get actually is this kind of a ground of cultivation, you know, with bunds, and I think Meghna had much better images actually of that bund, and then you had this divisive ground, and we put our ears to this, and you can hear the crabs coming through, you know. I mean, these people are not going to last, but it's interesting to see here the Dutch who are dismantling their levees, building levees over here in concrete, you know. So that sense of improvement, you know, modernization actually of the bund is problematic. But the bund itself is problematic. People over here lived on high ground. They built mounds. They never lived behind bunds, you know. And so it's a complete you know, sort of appropriating actually of a model of design that comes actually with a particular seeing of rivers. And then if I take you to the mountains, you know, this is the Tibetan plateau. But there was a time actually when flows, if you still consider them flows, began from mountain ranges, if you look at early maps, because the entire mountain was seen actually as a source of rivers. And so if you think about it like that, you know, as problematic as it is, given what I've been talking about, you come down actually to Mount Kailash. I mean, and this is what most people actually saw in India as Mount Kailash. It was the entire Tibetan mountain. It was a mountain of mountains. And as a mountain of mountains, actually, I mean, if you just think about it, the average height here is 16,000 feet, which is higher than Mont Blanc here in Europe. You know, so if an entire plateau, which is the size of Western Europe, actually is a mountain. Now, that is what you would think was venerated. So when people climbed the Himalayas, they entered it where the rivers, so-called rivers, came out, and they went to various points because they worshipped the entirety of it. But somehow, you know, and this is what you see actually. This is from Kanyakumari. This is an 1840s drawing by a German cartographer, and you see actually that this is, you know, Kanyakumari, from what you were talking about this morning. Actually, Kanyakumari then goes up actually the Tibetan plateau, and it's only the end of the Tibetan plateau there, you know, Leh Valley is over there, and then it goes down to Siberia on the other side. But that's the height of the mountain. It's majestic, you know. But then you have people following tracks. I mean, you have surveyors who break that, and they now take rivers to a particular point. So these are 4 points actually that today are traveled by pilgrims as the Char Dham. They were marked by surveyors actually, and now people believe that Gangotri is the source of the Ganges. Ask anybody in India what's the source of the Ganges and they tell you Gangotri. It was a construction actually through drawing and through surveying actually up a point. And this is now what happens to Mount Kailash. It ceases to be this entirety of the mountain. It becomes one mountain peak that just looks good, I think, or, you know, it's been found actually for some reason to be, you know, significant because of its shape primarily. But then you get this, because the pilgrims, look at the pilgrims lining up. This is where we were. This is our picture. We were caught in this tsunami, you know, where pilgrims are being washed off actually because people have built on the edge of what they see to be a line of a river, you know, and rain has come down the hillside. Rain doesn't come this way, it comes this way. And it just washed them off. You know, I mean, of course, this was a glacier burst also, et cetera, but we were very lucky actually to be rescued by the army in this particular landscape. But this is the consequence actually of much of river thinking. And then, of course, once you define flows, I mean, another consequence is that I then see rivers shift. I mean, this is something that, you know, people love today. There are atlases being created actually to show moving rivers just because we have the technology to see them. And so now satellite technology is being used to define actually flows on a day-to-day basis, on an hour-to-hour basis, on a minute-to-minute basis, and you begin to see the shifting. And so that is actually leading many people to design in particular ways by projecting, you know, changing flow patterns, you know. And then of course, you know, you also train a flow, and then you dam it. So even before, you know, you can't have a dam without defining the two sides of a flow. Of a wetness, and so that is what you do. Which is, I always take the example of the Amazon as being one of the most difficult rivers to dam. I mean, say wetnesses to dam, just because it can't be contained as easily as any of the others. And then, of course, once you call them out, you know, they can be extended in pipes, in drains, et cetera, and then they become both the cause and the solution of flood. So flood is a drainage problem. That's the way in which many people and many administrators in India see it. This one we find particularly exciting. Just because, I mean, this is the Sabarmati in Ahmedabad. So I moved away from the Ganga for the time being, the Ganges. But we saw this in 2 times of the year, actually. There was a certain, you know, what people are thinking of as a dry riverbed. And this actually as one when the monsoon waters have come, you know. But then Gandhi gathered on this. But I would like to think that he never gathered on a riverbed. He actually gathered on a plain, you know. But we have defined it to be a river. And therefore, we have actually now displaced these people in order to construct a riverfront, and we have brought water from 200 miles away in order to construct a river. We brought it from another river, so-called the Narmada River, actually by a dam over there, and there's a canal that comes through, actually over here in the, you know, in the upper district of this, actually, in order to create this wetness. So it's a lake, it's not a river, but you get this wonderful real estate, you know, things like this that. And then, of course, this is one of my favorites, actually. This is the Bharat Mata temple, actually, in Varanasi. You know, once you have rivers, you also have, I should say a geographic surface. You have India, actually, that has become an object of veneration in a temple. And this was actually built by, in 1936 by, altruistic person in Varanasi, but Gandhi was at its inaugural, and the idea was to unite people around a nation state that was about to be liberated from the British, and gain independence. And so can people in India, and this is a question that has often been asked, can people actually unite? Because, people like, John Strachey and others believed that Indians did not have a unified vision, actually, of the subcontinent. It was a British construction. And so there was this massive effort to educate people into, actually, a region that would unite them. But what we forget, actually, is that a river is an act, actually, of possession, communalizing. And so today, you're actually finding that India is more divisive than ever, actually, and it's a consequence of a creation of a geographic surface. So rivers are being fought over and conflicted, waters are being channeled elsewhere. This, it's an absolute political disaster. This ground is basically the, I think we heard it in a couple of presentations also. And this I saw in Delhi last year, that when this was a sign that kept flashing, differently, and it said, save and adopt an aged being, adopt a tree, adopt an animal, adopt a river. Rivers now are granted rights. And so you've now defined them and created a being, even though you can never see a river ever, actually in its entirety, anytime, even from in a satellite. But we've constructed this object, actually, that now is not only an object of veneration, but it's an object to which we can grant rights. And so we've, I think we've gone around full circle, actually, to construct a natural object, to the extent that it is now alive. So what we have over here now is, if I take this, the question that we're asking now is, what does it take to see this moment, to see in this moment, and to see this moment as a ground of design, rather than that moment as a ground of design. So we're really talking about displacing much of what has happened in 2,500 years, but we feel that this is what is happening in India. India, actually, there's a profound dissonance between river and rain. There are people who are inhabiting this in their offices, and the moment they step out of their offices, they are living actually in another world. So this constant duality actually explains what many people consider to be informal settlements, or poverty or underdevelopment. These are all signs, actually, to us of rain and of holding systems and of a life, actually, that is grounded in rain, that cannot accommodate, actually, river thinking and flow reasoning. It works actually much more in a field setting. So one of the things that we're sort of exploring, and before I give it to Anu, is actually that when you consider an Earth's surface, and this is a Walsberger's map, actually, a medieval map by Andreas Walsberger, what is interesting about this is that you have an Earth, and then you have concentric circles or concentric layers of water, of like what we call the hydrosphere, I guess, atmosphere, and fire. And what we are suggesting is that that's not the way to look at it, actually. The way we should look at it, actually, is that these are coincident spheres, not concentric spheres. And as coincident spheres, then design is an act of negotiating the place of wetness against, actually, some of the other elements. But that's only a start. But Anu now will take us, actually, through some of the design initiative. Just looking back, just a few slides. I know I've probably taken too long over this. But a few of our projects, actually, that we ask you to see, actually, as negotiating of wetness rather than the orchestrating of land and water.
So I don't want to worry you. Is this, can you hear me? Yeah. I won't be as long as Dilip, and we made this choice because a lot of what you're hearing really is very much part of the book, Invention of Rivers, which is, we are waiting for it to come out. And we just felt that the thesis is so clear in his mind that I can't do what he just did. So, so I just thought I'll reflect a little bit on some of the work that we have been doing through this lens, because I think as many of you who are designers or even other researchers, we tend to look back. I mean, we move forward with things, and then we look back at some of the things we've conceptualized and realize that at times we just didn't have the vocabulary for what we were trying to do. And maybe in our case, we think that, even though we ourselves use the word water, that in some ways we were pursuing wetness in our pedagogy, in our teaching, in our own research for a long time. And so what I'm just going to go through just a few slides which sort of capture that, and what you're seeing behind me is work we do with our first year students, design students. And we found that forests, and particularly in post-industrial sites, are what we would call emergent places where wetness is everywhere. I mean, it's in the ground, it's in the geology, it's in the rock, it's in plants, it's in buildings, it's in the air. And so drawing really becomes a way of actually walking the site. Or let's say that we started to think about this whole idea of traversing, which I heard many of you talk about today, traversing landscape, field work. And the whole idea of field work became a way of us sort of uncovering wetness. And so, we very often sort of invoke Henry David Thoreau, who talks about walking as not as a act of getting from here to there, but the enterprise of the day. So for us, drawing becomes the enterprise. So drawing becomes a means of uncovering this. So it's not something we could think about prior. We had to actually sort of walk and draw to start to sort of see these kinds of worlds. So, we've had many conversations about embankments and even referenced back our work on the Mississippi. So when we look back at it, I think we had even at that time asked the question that, is the Mississippi a river or is it a landscape? And I think what we are really talking about at that time was that, we were not talking about challenging the representation of a river or that the rivers are being controlled. We were really talking about, I think, what Dilip just described, the very being, sort of the invention of rivers themselves. And so, many of our screen prints, which the middle one that you see, but the image on the left is a geological map by Harold Fisk from the 1940s. And we sort of have moved away from this idea that, the river is an entity and it's just shifting. But the construction of that landscape itself is through degrees of wetness. And so for us, in the making of this project, which some of you may be familiar with, that it was done through screen printing, so we really looked at it that for us it was not an act of representation, but an act of construction. So the working with the screen printing, every layer, in some of your printers here, you'll realize that there's a viscosity of inks, there's thin inks, thick inks, transparency, layering. So there's a whole ambiguity that you have to work with, and there are accidents in it, and there are intentions in it. And so for us, the sort of the working of the screen prints, even though they were narratives of a kind, was also about actually building a landscape itself. And when we came to Bangalore and the Deccan, and many of you referenced today the whole idea of sort of the tanks, and I think we were talking in the morning, so some of you might not have been there. There was, that there are these sort of water bodies on the Deccan that we today call lakes, and that these really are actually economies that work between gradients of wetness. So there is silt being gathered there, there's bricks being made, and they're really not water bodies at all. And it's a whole enterprise, colonial enterprise, or as Dilip would say, it's a Greek enterprise of drawing the line around it. So in some of the work we were doing at that time, I think this was a sort of a consciousness, and we use sometimes events or practices, and what you see on your left is this I would say relatively new practice of the Ganpati immersion, which happens in Mumbai, in a great sort of event, and in a smaller degree happens in Bangalore as well. But if you think about that event, actually the deities were made out of clay. So, it's like before the monsoons, the deities are made, the clay is dug out from the tanks, and the rains come. And the event goes on for about a month through the streets, through homes. And, the tanks fill up, and then you immerse the deity back in. So it was a way of sort of opening the story that this is really a landscape in time, and it's about gradients of wetness. So sometimes as designers, it's not only about, unless we are looking for modes or sort of strategies of visualization through which we can actually open these stories up. And in some ways, it is a design landscape. So many people look at the Deccan and the tanks as natural. I know that people in this room don't, but the operating sort of infrastructure is this embankment, the Bandh. And so for most of the year, it's the embankment which is existing there. It's a place for all kinds of activities. Today it's roads. And there are different types of wetnesses on both sides. So at times it is water. At times it's agriculture, when the monsoons pass, that whatever is left is passed on to the other side. So it was a very complex system. And so even when we today call it wetlands, we really are making a big mistake, because wetlands almost mean there's a certain degree of wetness that should always be there. And it's a term we've acquired from ecologies in the West. And it doesn't operate here. These are not natural wetlands. So there are a lot of people in Bangalore today trying to preserve the tanks as wetlands, and we often feel that it's the wrong vocabulary that we are using. And of course, we've talked a lot about the coastline and the making of the coastline, and it's not only the hardening, the porosity of the coastline, but its very existence. And as Dilip mentioned, that you talk to a surveyor and you say, how do you draw a line, in landscapes like this? And this is, of course, just the beach, but mangroves, practices of salt collection, it really is an assertion. And so for us in this project, sort of posing the estuary versus the island became a way of starting to open up this question of, what many people have referred to over here as, sweet water and salt water, or fresh and, saline, or what we would call the sea and the monsoon. So it's not a binary between land and water, it's really between the monsoon waters and the sea. And an estuary is a place that negotiates it. So the sectional reading, which some of you are familiar with and some of you might not be, really became a kind of a strategy by which we were able to open that conversation. And the coast, which is really drawn in other maps very, very strongly around Mumbai Island, and it's called an island, kind of disappeared in this sort of strategy of drawing sections. But also, there are the practices which you see at the back over here, these boats being pulled up. This is Worli Fort. And we realized that there are many moments in which these, as somebody talked today, that there are these natural cycles and practices that are at times in sync with each other. So before the monsoons, the fishermen actually just drag all their boats up. So the whole event of sort of bringing up the boat for us was like a kind of gradient that was continuous for them. So it was, it was in the wetness of the sea, and it comes back into their towns and into their markets. And so it became a way of just starting to sort of think about these landscapes differently. And of course, in the middle, there's a proposition using some of these ideas of section, thresholds, sort of territories that I won't talk about here. It's not about talking about individual projects. But I also want to talk, like we do also, besides our own work, we do, we teach. So this was a studio we did in Jerusalem. What's really interesting, for us in the Middle East, and this is the Kidron Valley, which extends from Jerusalem all the way to the Dead Sea, that, of course, land is contested, we all know that, but so is water. I mean, it's the most contested thing. So the moment you use the vocabulary of land and water, you're in a battle. I mean, they're even fighting for sewage water the moment you call it water and you want to commodify it. And so we were sort of trying to find ways in which this whole cycle by which you have flow systems which are challenged, how do you start thinking of other cycles of sort of holding water which is embodied in the landscape? And you're just seeing just a glimpse of projects. And again, as I said, I'm not trying to show projects, but drawings which started to open. One of them on the top, which is dealing with the birds, was starting to see this valley as part of a much larger system of the Rift Valley, which is a migration routes. And birds know no boundaries. So there are a lot of projects or ways of thinking that actually start to work with the birds. But even in terms of architectural thinking, we were looking at the sort of the valley, and we realized that the bottoms were contested and the tops were contested. And by that I mean most of the sort of settlements which are sort of dominating are built on the hilltops or on the ridges. And the Palestinian people or the Arabs who actually occupied the valleys were not allowed to do that by a master plan done by the British, which said that these had to be ecological zone. So by actually making the ecology sort of become the dominant thing, they were sort of taken away. So we sort of found that sort of occupying the middle territory, which is neither the bottom or the top, and starting to work with practices that took some of the sewage of Jerusalem and made it as part of the landscape, became a way we could open conversations with people on both sides.
I mean, interestingly here, if I can just add a point on the Bedouins. I mean, the people who are actually suffering the most are the nomadic. I mean, and they remain under the radar, actually. I mean, and we talk about birds, but we also think a lot actually about nomads. And nomads actually, we define them as actually unsettled in some way or following some cycle of settlement in a way. To some extent, they actually just occupy grounds that are unsettled, that never settle, so the desert, the sea, the thing. I mean, these are, and that's a different way of actually seeing nomads. They never held actually the Earth's surface to a configuration.
Of course, here even geology is contested. If anybody's been there, I mean, they are fighting over which level strata, deep strata, should be seen as the origin. So it's a fascinating place to talk about wetness. And we've been also in the Western Ghats with our students, and this whole idea of enclave thinking, and I think we sort of touched on it in the Sundarbans, where when you start to think of it as a heritage site, and the Western Ghats, like the Sundarbans, has been declared a World Heritage Site because of it being a biodiversity hotspot, you start to make enclaves for tigers, and then you take people out. But when you think about tigers don't live in enclaves. They used to roam freely across the Western Ghats and come, all the way, north. But it's not only people, it's also, communities, everybody is being sort of bifurcated. And we found that within our own field, let's say of landscape architecture, regional planning, the regional plan itself works with those kinds of boundaries. It works with a kind of zoning plan. And so when we started the studio, we sort of opened up this idea of splicing, that, we think that it's not only, that people don't settle here, tigers don't settle here. I mean, plants don't settle, they all splice themselves in. And like even if you think of the monsoons, it's, it splices itself in for a while, and the flora and fauna emerges, and then it sort of, recedes back into another territory. So what you're seeing here is just a glimpse of a project which started with a student who was working with this fragile weaves, and started to think of ways of threading back through the landscape, through the idea of splicing rather than territorializing. But it was everything to do with actually sort of reworking the system of wetness, which is in many, many forms in the Western Ghats. And just to sort of give a glimpse, it's not really, I'm actually doing a studio in this landscape right now, but these are images that Dilip and I created a few years ago when we traveled through the deserts of India, which is the northwest. And even when I first spoke to Lindsay about it, she said, it'll be interesting to talk about this in Monsoon, that it's not seen as a monsoon landscape, but this is intrinsically a monsoon landscape, and it's so dependent on the monsoons that it's actually quite fascinating to go to the desert to realize that wetness is everywhere. And just for example, this middle image, and I don't know if it's visible from the back, you see these kind of rectangles. These are actually pits, which are about 100 feet by 100 feet by about 30, 40 feet across.
Yeah, you can,
yeah.
Just saying.
And these are actually salt collection practices, which was actually set up by the British. These are not very old. But it's a fascinating system because it's all oriented to the monsoons. It's to the northwest and the southeast monsoons. And what it really does is, again, a pressure system. It is about salt and sweet, but actually sectionally. So when the monsoons come, these pits get filled up, and because of a pressure in the whole sort of sandy terrain, it pushes the salt into these pits. Saline water. And in 9 months, the wind, which is in the same direction, just kind of ruffles the surface and salt appears. So it's very little work, actually. Quite different from the Rann of Kutch, which is just below it, which is very labor intensive. And so there are many practices here which are really completely intrinsic to the monsoon. But what also became important to think about it is that we're not talking about geography, ecology. It's really about people. And so we were starting to really talk about here the musicians which roam between, from Pakistan to India without borders. There are potters who work in this landscape, which is completely, their practice is embodied in wetness. Again, it's salt and sweet, because the clay here is very salty, which makes the pots quite unique, and the whole process I won't go into. But even some of the dyers, today the fabrics, which many of you could buy at Fab India, many of them are dyed here. And there are very few people left here, but the salt and the wetness and the sand is really what makes the dyes actually fix and work. And so in every place we go, we are finding that if we sort of shift the lens of not even dry to wet, which is something we ourselves used to talk about a lot, and just think of gradients of wetness, it takes away that binary and gives us sort of many other sort of practices that we can sort of work with. And I'm just going to end with this slide and not maybe say too much about it, but as Dilip mentioned when he started that, a sequel to his book, which was really the argument about rivers are an invention, is a work that we are doing, which we are calling Ocean of Rain, which is an exhibition. And it's still happening, so as many of you, this is a work in progress, and we've been working through drawings, we've been working through photo works, we've been working through video, and we're trying to pull it together. And it's not a straightforward thing that we know exactly where it's going to go, but I think the search, which many of you, I sort of heard in your subtext, was we're all trying to search for a new vocabulary. What are the measures of when you think about the monsoons? What are the measures if you think of wetness? And we don't think we have the answer, but we're sort of looking for that through making and working. And I think I have just one more image. That's an irreverent ode to the monsoon. That's...
How long did that take?
Well, thank you. What an extraordinarily rich presentation. Thanks, Anu and Dilip. I think we've got a little while for a conversation about this material. We'll go on till about 8:15, I think, if that's okay. Perhaps I could open the discussion by sort of referring to something that I picked up in what you said towards the end about you really are beginning to design a new vocabulary for design, which I think is what's so significant about Anu and Dilip's work, and the idea of design as negotiating relations of wetness is one of the statements that you made, and design and drawing as a way of opening up conversations rather than providing solutions. And to me, those are two of the really significant things about your work. But maybe just one question. The significance of the sectional drawing is something that's also your work is so synonymous with. And if you could just talk about the sectional drawing a little as a way of opening up the conversation.
Should I?
Well.
Okay, I'll just take a shot at this. I think, the question was, I forget who it was. I think it was it Jesse? I think that made the point actually of the view from above and the negotiated world actually of practices in Kerala. And I think that to some extent for us is a very profound observation. Geography actually has a way of has set up the ground of the world and the ground of design with a view from above. It's magical actually, if you think about this dividing of land from water. And but the point in a more extended way actually is that when you look at the sea from above, the sea says nothing because it's a shifting landscape, it's a shifting ground, and so it's always shown as a blank. And you get the monsters of the deep generally drawn over there, or you get text there, or something like that. But the sea is disadvantaged in plan. And so when we were working on Bombay, that's when we actually began to really explore the section. And the section actually bringing in a depth, because that's the way the sea speaks. Any ship operator will tell you that they're conscious of the depth. And so soundings become actually their first preoccupation rather than a view from above. So when we started exploring the section, we found that it brought the sea onto terms actually with land that were compatible. Otherwise, the sea is always at a distance. So we're always looking for this kind of injustice, in the definition of the other that is actually caused by a representational strategy. And then we built on it actually in terms of section. We built on it and extended it, that the land and sea, what allows you to see spatially actually on land, because it speaks so richly to you, from, in the view from above, is that I can actually mark points and actually measure distance. And in the sea, actually, I can't do that. I can't hold my points just because of the fluidity of water. So the way in which I actually measure distance at sea is actually by the celestial sphere, by actually documenting time. So the sea and land then became, also not just surface and depth, but it also became, or plan and section, it also became, space and time. And so on.
But in some ways, I think the section was latent in a lot of our work before that, and not so much in the Mississippi. I think we started to think about it because we were thinking about the horizon there, and we realized that the horizon actually opened up the section for us. But to some extent, I think what Dilip was referring to in the sections, and some of you, if you're not familiar with the drawings, there's a moment in which land is black, and what is seen as the coastline and the sea after that is also black. And it was sometimes it's an accident. So, so the drawing becomes a kind of practice also. So it's not that we knew that was going to happen. And I distinctly remember a moment when Dilip was cutting exactly 159 sections through Mumbai, and I only know that number because we thought we'd make a model and we had to price what it would cost to etch 159 pieces of plexi. So we counted it at that time. But there was there was a certain moment and labor in that work in which something emerged, and we were able to look at it. So as designers, it's not that we have thought it through. So the act of doing the work and then sometimes finding an opportunity that comes up. And so it was a kind of section we were working on, and to some extent, in Ocean of Rain, we are trying to get back to some of the materiality that we were interested in. We're sort of working with what we're calling stain works and drawings again in a different way. So it's a constant process of inventing the adequacy of the section for that question we are asking.
But to some extent, if I can just add one more thing, Lindsay, I think that we find that it is a ground for practices actually that is more respectful of the gradient that we are talking about, actually, that allows people to inhabit wetness of different degrees, whether it's on mounds or on the coast. There is that sense of rise and fall. And we found it actually true of the Native American mounds in the United States, that they inhabited actually mounds as opposed to this edge of the sea. But again, I think this really builds on Jesse's point. I think that practices are more at home on a section than they are actually in a plan. And a plan is really a controlling device. It's a controlling device, but it has controlled the Earth's surface before it has controlled people and put them into zones and land use structures.
Great. Questions from the floor? Ed, and then Pushpa, David. Maybe just take some down. Ed, do you want to start? Pushpa, David, Harsh. Okay. Shall we take two questions or two or three? Yeah.
Whatever you feel.
Sorry, I took overstep right there.
Thanks for a great presentation. It's a real honour to have you in London, as Lindsay said. I was frustrated because I was going to ask about sections. I feel like Lindsay stole my question. But in regards to the section, you talk about the being sort of allowing you to explore the gradient, but it allows us to explore the gradient of topography. But it still relies on the line a lot of the time as a way of dividing between so what we understand as land and water. Many of your drawings do sort of blur and sort of create those ambiguities, as did the final film that you showed. And I was wondering whether attempts to sort of get away from this requirement of the line and attempts to get away from this or get closer to the workings of time. If you could talk a bit more about that and the usefulness of moving image in particular in dealing with time.
Great. Do you mind if I take two questions?
Yeah.
Okay. Pushpa. And then we can roll them together.
Thank you for that very rich presentation. I wondered whether I could bother you to maybe think a little bit more about the usefulness of this notion of landscape, both of you being landscape architects particularly, and the fact that you went very carefully to kind of disturb this binary between land and water. And so are you bothered by the existence of the term land within this notion of landscape, or how do you make it a more useful analytical tool within the realm of landscape architecture? What is its usefulness?
I'll take the first, you take the second, yeah? Okay. Because actually he's not a landscape architect. I'm the landscape architect, yeah. Though we call him, he's landscape architect by marriage, so he's been introduced like that. The question about the section, to some extent, when we were working on Mumbai, again, as I said, the section sort of became, because we were, got invented in a particular way because we were really concerned about the coastline and the line, and it allowed us to go away from it. But you were right that, to some extent, there is a different kind of bounding in that section because, when, as Dilip showed, there's earth and air. And so we know that the section also is a kind of abstraction. But what we started to get interested in was that when you use sections not as a singular section, but when you start to use them in rhythms, so whether they're planimetrically, and most of our sections were actually cut over photographs, so they were cut on what we call photo walks. They were actually about walking through landscapes. We felt we were able to sort of get away a little bit from that. I'm not saying that we couldn't, but so there, I think, in fact, Pushpa, though this was not your question, but I was thinking about the question of rhythms that you opened up. We were very conscious of there are so many kinds of rhythms. So the rhythm of walking, the rhythm of relationships. So in those kinds of sections, we were able to bring things far. We were able to collapse things in different ways, and so it was less about the literal, separation of wetness, but in terms of sort of time. So in some ways, we look at those sections as a time. There is time involved in it because they are neither here nor there. You're actually inhabiting them in movement or wherever you want to land yourself in them. I think that's. But I think you asked about the moving image. For years we used to be asked that because we never worked with video till very recently. And to some extent, we were bothered by just the fact that because videos move, they are about movement. In fact, we felt that some of the ways of working with photo works where we had to still the movement, we were able to find the measure of the movement. I don't know if that makes sense. Just because things are moving doesn't mean we see movement. I mean, we're seeing movement literally, but we're not aware of it. But so again, these are just some studies. And so what we got fascinated with, just stuff we had collected was, at least in the last video, which was less about description, it was starting to find, was that wetness is everywhere. So, what you saw in the tank is one of the tanks of Varanasi, which are not so important compared to the ghats. But it's in every wall, it's everywhere. So it's, just the plaster of the walls, everything is absorbing. And there are things we are thinking about. So they are sketches of a kind. And so we're trying to find a way to use video that actually works for the idea. It's not video in itself that does it,
I mean, the importance is actually getting away from the land-water divide to begin with. I mean, and so, they all our representations, we are beholden actually to, in some respect. And that actually is true of landscape. Landscape is intrinsically a colonizing act. And so when I'm, we were sort of, to some extent, we've been writing this thing for a while now. Is urbanism colonialism with design consent? And I can say that actually of landscape. Is landscape actually colonialism by design consent? Interestingly, I can sort of relate it to actually some of the, many of you spoke as anthropologists today and actually said, we are not a designer, I'm anthropologist. No. And we are all designers and complicit actually in this act of design, in this first act of design. I think, and so it's interesting actually to look at landscape. And when you use the term particularly urban, is urban landscape, I mean, it's a, to some extent, it's a redundancy in our mind, because the notion of the city is a notion that has come about actually on the ground of the river, and it actually promotes a dryness. It promotes it. I mean, so we just think of the best. I mean, what actually distinguishes the city from the village actually is that it is better drained. It is better drained. I have pakka drains as opposed to kacha drains, and so I have pakka roads, which is actually this finished structures versus the thing, which is an aspiration that all Indians have now, is for the pakka and for the urban, what you call the urban landscape. So it's a double. It's a kind of reinforcing actually the act of colonialism that is carried in this. So we are actually trying to search for an alternative, kind of language of habitation as well that cannot be caught in the urban-rural kind of binary, because that, I mean, it is criminal actually what has happened in India on the ground of the urban-rural. I mean, the selling of land and the kind of rampant so-called urbanization. I mean, and we designers actually are promoting that, and I think that that's what landscape architects are doing as well. They're promoting actually a language of disaster. And so, I mean, is there to some extent we see a kind of urgency, and we see an urgency actually in all the questions that were raised today. We don't have to look to climate change actually, in order to raise some of these very fundamental questions. It's just, right now seems to be just pulling people together. But landscape is complicit in,
David and Harsh?
Thanks very much. I had, I guess, two questions of clarification. First one is, why rain? I understand what wetness is doing. Why is rain then featured more than, say, evaporation in terms of that cycle? Mm-hmm. Why not just oceans of wetness? I'm not sure what's the relationship. And the second one, in terms of the invention of rivers, is there a difference between the invention of rivers and the invention of mountains, or the invention of salt, or the invention of tigers? And why isn't all nouns appropriative and divisive? Is there something particular about rivers, or is this a way into a more open and fluid methodology, and rivers is a brilliant example?
It feels like I shouldn't ask my question, because this is really amazing, and it's like it's one of those moments. But I'm kind of in opposition to what David just said, because for me the river and what you're doing with the river is kind of like what we were talking about about monsoon air this morning, about in terms of conceptual frameworks, in terms of what process of research and thinking can do, is in a way it's decolonize. I mean, again, I'm not using the word in a normative sense, but to decolonize the way something is thought of. Mm-hmm. So in a way, I mean, my question was maybe you could, I don't know, comment about how you went about that process.
How do you?
How you went about that process. I mean, for example, today, what you presented to us was, in a way, a kind of a narrative as well. I mean, there were narratives, a way of sort of talking about stories and spaces and placements and mobilities of humans going to different places and essentially enacting different processes. And so in a way, there is a process of engaging with the archive, there is a process of engaging with a certain kind of history in the production, which, and you're reading through things, and you're deciding to also make choices of not reading certain other things. And so in a way, there is a practice here, and I feel there is an architect. I'm not an architect. There is also that architectural, material, infrastructural, urban thing where you let sort of therefore the river be the object through which that is made imminent. And so anyway, I was just wondering if you could just comment on that. But yeah, I really enjoyed this. Thank you so much.
I mean, for one thing, I mean, we're not arguing against distinguishing. The point we're making is, why don't we just accept the fact actually that rivers are a product of design? So we're not, we're saying that, okay, there are two worlds over here. I mean, you've chosen actually to anchor in this moment, and you've constructed a world around it. Let us give other people a chance actually to anchor in another moment. I mean, and then to come to your point, actually, I mean, we would say that you can anchor in any moment, of the water cycle, as it were. I mean, it's called the water cycle or the hydrologic cycle. To some extent, itself is problematic because it's always presented as a flow. And it actually anchored on the river, at least that's how I talk about it in the book. So there are many problems, I mean, with that particular choice. But if I look at it actually as allowing for a multiplicity of possibilities, the diversity in the world. I mean, if I think of the Australian Aboriginal people, or if I think of the Native Americans, if I think of they could have anchored in any other part. So I guess the larger point that we're making is that the clash of cultures that was written about actually in the 1960s and 70s was not necessarily a clash of East and West. And and many people have raised this point and may raise this question: why did the West colonize the East and not the East the West? Samuel Johnson asked it, and and others have asked it since. But if you change that question and say it has nothing to do with East and West, it was actually rivers that colonized rain, or it was actually the academic that colonized people. I mean, and that way I find that academics are probably the most complicit actually in this definition actually of empirical science to some extent, and the ground of empiricism, and oikumene, which the Greeks called it, or inhabited earth, actually the ground, empirical ground. And I think I was just sharing this with you. There is some reason why, empiricism shares the same roots as empire, and that's the way in which, I mean, something like what Alexander did actually in the promotion of science and the promotion of actually networks, political networks, he had actually conflated what is, to some extent, another understanding of the polis, and the city actually as a grounded network system that that promoted a kind of empirical knowledge structure that went with it. So I would think that you could anchor in any time, in any other thing. But the only reason we have chosen to actually demonstrate a possibility and have chosen rain as only because in the muddying actually of the land-water divide, not just muddying, but actually in the doing away with it, we had the opportunity actually of a moment in the monsoon, actually of the profuse wetness or the reading actually of a wetness that is not necessarily water, but that actually opens up a kind of fluidity and liquidity in which one is actually an immanent presence rather than a transcendent, sort of individual. And so the idea of actually designing, it's strange actually to choose somebody like a Rem Koolhaas to associate with, but when he says actually there's no such thing as the city, why don't we all accept being within it? I mean, to some extent he's calling for an immanence in the wrong place, but maybe I would think that it calls for an immanence here actually, and so that is the only idea why we actually chose rain and associated it with because it made the point, and we could actually anchor in a moment of monsoon that we could, in some sense, record. And so you could accuse us of that. To some extent, we are also being kind of empirical, in a manner of speaking. But really, the alternative is to just put down the pen and,
But I think, but to your point, we do oscillate between ocean of rain and ocean of wetness in terms of even the title of this talk. We went through this back and forth. And we have actually started a platform that we are calling Ocean of Wetness. If you go to our website, which we just recently launched, we do call it Ocean of Wetness because we feel that's the broader term. But for the purpose of this exhibition we are working on, which was more specific to a certain idea of the monsoon in a particular territory, we are using Ocean of Rain. So I think it's an interesting sort of observation you made.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Tim. Are there other questions? Because I want to know when to stop. Right at the back. Thanks, Meghna.
I want to come back to the point you made just a moment ago about landscape and its complicitness. And I think that in many ways landscape has been very culpable because it's a practice of bounding and of framing and of drawing lines, and it's led to first of all, a rejection of landscape as a practice. You have Tim Cresswell, for example, saying, I prefer place to landscape, and we should never use the term landscape. It's awful. It speaks about practices of empire and representation of power and all of these kinds of things. Or perhaps Raymond Williams saying a working country can never be called a landscape, which of course he then goes on to refute in his book, but that's neither here nor there. At any rate, the question I want to ask is whether you think that the ways that you're proposing for bounding and framing shift landscape practice into something that's more authentically, to use a problematic word, but authentically rooted in substantive places, and whether that has political agency and ecological agency.
Can we have the last question? Okay. One at the back. It's Meghna at the back. Yeah, no. And then we'll have the two questions.
Thank you. That was really enjoyable. I mean, very provocative and really inspired by that. And I just am interested in my own work, which actually doesn't focus on embankments. I try and look at ethics, politics, and ecology together. And in your work, I feel that you're doing this act of thinking of flows and not, in sort of question that preceded mine, of not anchoring anywhere or not sort of stopping or framing it just in one moment, but seeing it as a cycle and a flow. And I just wondered whether there was also something to do with the sort of disentangling of something which is so entangled already, that does the act that you're not trying to do, which is that by actually using, and so not just the usage of words, but maybe also And I sort of take this part of the question for my second part, which is that do we not do that also in disciplines then? And so then we kind of distill out and create these composite silos of I'm an economic anthropologist or an environmental anthropologist, or I'm a designer. No, I'm not an architect. And I think I'm just sort of struggling with how when we are trying to do things together, we end up separating or having to separate it. And how do some of us who aspire to sort of try and create together then end up doing that without making the error, the first error, or the sort of first sort of active design where you have to frame it somehow? And how do you do that?
If I can take that question first. I mean, when you talk about, the act of separation actually, interestingly enough, it's a medieval concept actually, as a metaphysical recognition of it as a metaphysical act actually that constructs the ground. But we must remember actually that what we are questioning over here is actually only one act of creation, and that is actually the land-water divide. Which doesn't mean actually that we are challenging the act of separation per se, but actually reflecting on it actually as an act of design. And so it sort of leaves the room open actually for other possibilities. But that is precisely, I guess ultimately what we're asking is why is this why is this particular line not politicized? When people talk about it, actually, they ask questions, where do you draw the line? What is its nature? What is its temporality? Which is to some extent, I guess what Jesse was asking, a number of others were asking, actually. The question is, what is it? The people are doing it, ecotones now, they're doing, and it's defined by people, or it's defined by others. It's all that sort of an understanding. But the existence of it actually carries a politics that is more serious and unquestioned. So if you look at it at that level, and look at it as and ask, not only that actually, what follows from it actually is that water is dominated. The whole idea of the act of separation, we believe, was constructed on the ground of wanting an infrastructure. If you go back actually and read, say for example, the 12 labors of Hercules, what you will see actually when he cleans the stables of King Augeas, what does he do actually? He lifts the Alpheus, he diverts the Alpheus actually and cleans the stables, he diverts a river, it was like a hose pipe, and that's what two lines allow. It allows you to make a hose pipe actually of water and then use water at will, to do anything, and so it's not just, the Army Corps of Engineers, they're all Hercules and, in one form or another. The same with someone like Xerxes, and when he's approaching Babylon, does the same, with the Gindis and does the same, divides it up and, so that, it weakens the river. These guys were fighting, they were fighting water. So this subduing of water and this thing, I think, should be one of our first concerns. We have questioned the man-woman, we have questioned, so many other binaries. Why are we not questioning this actually and seeing the domination actually of something? To the point of landscape, and is there another? It's an interesting question. I don't want to call it that at all. But the dissolution of disciplines actually that follows from the dissolution of the line is something that we want to actually open to question and discussion through this ocean of wetness conversation. And so what we've said is, something that we have found actually very troubling within the design field is actually the breaking into landscape and architecture and planning and things like that. And so this going on, dividing kind of world actually hasn't some beginning, where we, and so it is actually the product of this, act of right. So is there a chance actually whereby we actually maybe even take away professionalism in a sense? And so we're talking about a radical shift in politics, actually, that have sort of moved from the amateur to the professional, has brought us in as experts to people, and made people into, we raise this question constantly. How would we like to be observed, and studied, and then designed for, those kind of things, they all come from this ground. And is there so going back to this line, and can we actually orchestrate it differently? Can we can we devise practices actually that are much more in tune with a new reading of wetness rather than the land-water divide.
I just want to, address something that Meghna brought up, which might sort of clarify something which could be, maybe we were not very clear in how we sort of presented it today, is that when we talk about wetness, in some ways, you use the word anchoring. To some extent, we use that vocabulary because whether we are designers, whether we are settling in a place, whether it's a practice, wetness opens up the vocabulary of anchoring in a different way, in the sense that you're not bounding, you're not framing, but you have to find anchors. So in design discourse, we use that quite often, and sometimes we use it in a sense of how do you initiate a project. So it's not about the master plan, the end that we are trying to work backwards in time, but what is the DNA of the initiation? And it's not about it's a small project or a big project. It's like, what is that you do to set it on its... So we feel that those are the kinds of vocabularies we are searching for. And I absolutely agree with you that, the question that you feel you're not a designer and you think I'm not a researcher who does ethnographic research. I think those are false boundaries we make. We may need it to sort of study for a while, but we've been sort of having this conversation in the university, which is very problematic, especially the American university, where tenure is given in your field of specialization, which makes people very resistant to actually having that freedom.
But Tim, that's a response for you too. I mean, this could be another starting point of design in a way, anchoring.
Thank you everybody for being here, and we'll start again at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. If you can come back, that would be great.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.